Welcome everybody to Mr. King's first video lecture of the new school year, and today we're going to be looking at information that will help you with Common Assessment number 1. And Common Assessment number 1 deals with trusts, robber barons, and the growth of big corporations during the time period that we call the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900. So we're going to get started here. There's some questions, and I like to use questions as a starting point, as you might know or not know, but I think that all learning begins with some questions. So what do I need to know? That is, what do you need to know in particular with regards to the 1870-1900 period that will help you answer the common assessment that we're going to be looking at? So number one, what is capitalism? And when did the United States become a really capitalist society? And again, I think the answer is 1870 to 1900, so just anticipate that. Number two, how did a very few individuals get so rich? That there have always been wealthy people in the United States, even before we were the United States. Going back to the colonial period, there were wealthy planters, slave owners, merchants. But we really begin to see in the period after the Civil War, again from 1870 to 1900, the rapid rise of a group, and a very small group, by the way, of capitalists. Sometimes they're called robber barons, sometimes they're called captains of industry, that really, through their work and knowledge, were able to amass vast fortunes. So how did people get so rich? And so very few people. Number three, why large corporations, or trusts, as they are also called in this time period? And were they good or bad? Number three, besides mansions and yachts, actually that's number four, I'm sorry. There are two number threes. Besides mansions and yachts, what did money get a wealthy individual? And that is, yes, we know that money allows one to buy material things, build nice buildings, and own lots of things that confer status. But what else does money get a wealthy individual? So that's a good question. And then fourth and lastly, what happened to democracy during the Gilded Age? The idea of democracy is the group, the people, public good, the welfare of the people. So if you think about the fact that very few individuals got very rich, what does that mean for the rest of American society? And so what happened to democracy during the Gilded Age? So those are some questions I think that will help us and help you in particular understand this period and also then be able to address the common assessment. So moving on. Capitalism and large-scale corporations today versus 1900. So you see on the left-hand side of the screen, can you name these corporations? And I think obviously you can. McDonald's, it's no surprise. McDonald's exists everywhere, in every single state, in every single town, community across the United States. McDonald's is one of the most recognized and even, I would say, popular corporations. Though sometimes you don't think of McDonald's as a corporation, it certainly is. And it stretches from coast to coast, as I said, even in Alaska, Hawaii, and actually around the globe. Below that, I'm sure you can recognize those objects as Apple iPhones. And again, Apple is a large corporation that has really experienced in the last 15 years an incredible revival. After having had some initial success, it kind of disappeared, and it's come back better and bigger than ever. So we look at corporations today and we kind of we take it for granted. Of course we have large corporations. That's normal. Was it always that way? And the answer is no, it wasn't. And again, we saw some statistics in the PowerPoint that you saw in class and that you can access, that prior to the Civil War, 7% of all activity in the United States was done by corporations, and by 1900 that was up over 70%. So clearly something took place in the time period that we're looking at, the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900. We see the rapid rise and growth of these corporations, and you see there in the center several examples. On the top you see a map, and you might say, well, gee, what does that represent? Well, that represents a railroad corporation, the New York Central Railroad, owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, Cornelius Vanderbilt was not the sole owner. Corporations, as we know, are owned by many people. They're called investors. Cornelius Vanderbilt just happened to be the largest investor, and he owned the most stock in the New York Central Railroad. So he had a controlling interest. And you can see how far and wide the New York Railroad, the New York Central Railroad, spread in the time period that we're looking at. And it would even expand further afield as well. Down below, you see the idea of another company called Standard Oil. Now, I know that gets kind of cut off on your screen, but you can see that Standard Oil was the creation of John Rockefeller and his business associate Henry Flagler. They started in Cleveland and amassed a large oil company that existed and operated across state lines and in many states, and provided people with kerosene to light lamps, and later oil that would be used in the combustion engine, which is invented sometime in the 1880s. And you can see on the right hand side too some political cartoons. The top shows Cornelius Vanderbilt kind of stuck at the front of a locomotive engine that's charging ahead, and he's got two arms out and he's scooping up people. And that is how Cornelius Vanderbilt got so big, and why we see, what is a large-scale corporation? Well, it starts as a small company that then begins to grow by either building or more typically by acquiring other companies and consolidating. So the idea of large-scale corporations that you see at the top of the screen is really the act of acquiring other corporations that do the same thing. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was very good at acquiring regional train lines that were his competitors, and then he created a huge network under the New York Central Railroad. And you can see John Rockefeller down below on an oil barrel, Standard Oil, and you can see him holding up a lamp in one hand and the globe in the other hand, and he has some kind of funny crown on his head, suggesting that he cornered and dominated the oil market, which he did very effectively, I would say also very ruthlessly. So again, the idea of acquisition. So that gives you an idea. We have big corporations today, McDonald's and Apple, and you can probably name others, and how do they get so big? So that's the question. But it seems that Americans and the American economic engine in society is going to be identified with large corporations, for good or for bad. Moving forward. So, Cornelius Vanderbilt's story in brief, because one of the Common Assessment political cartoons deals directly with Cornelius Vanderbilt, and I think his story is a fairly good illustration or example of how this worked. Now, Cornelius Vanderbilt did not start out in railroads, though that's where he made most of his money. He began life as a steamship captain back in 1817, and he simply ran the boat. He piloted this steamship boat in and around New York City, the Hudson River, going back and forth between New York and New Jersey, Connecticut, etc. In 1826, the steamship owner for whom he worked died, and then Cornelius Vanderbilt became the owner of the steamship line, and he continued to expand his business in New York and then even into New England. In New England in the 1820s and 30s, textile mills, that is, producing fabrics and turning those fabrics into clothing, became a big industry, and Cornelius Vanderbilt got in on shipping the finished goods and or raw materials back and forth between New England and the rest of the country. So he does quite well as a steamship owner, expands his operations. In 1848, moving ahead, gold is discovered in California. Now, that's great. There's one problem. Most people live in the eastern part of the United States, and to get to California, that's the idea. If I want to cash in and try to find this gold, well, I need to get to California. Very difficult to do overland. It took months. The weather, the terrain, the mountains, that is, and the Indians. So it was a difficult journey. So what Cornelius Vanderbilt did was he got into ocean-going steamships that would sail down from the East Coast down to Nicaragua, that is the eastern coast of Nicaragua. They would offload the goods and ware and people. They would go across Nicaragua, typically by train, and then they would get on another boat that would go on the western side from Nicaragua all the way up the coast around Mexico to California. And this was hugely profitable and very successful. So that's how Cornelius Vanderbilt gets started. So he expands and grows his business. He acquires other steamship operations, and by the 1850s, he gets involved in trains, and he really kind of understands that the age of steamship may be coming to an end, and that trains might be the next best thing, the next biggest thing. And so he gets a regional train line, the New York and Harlem line, which was bankrupt and moribund, and he injects cash and new equipment into the line, makes it profitable. And then by the time the Civil War comes along in the 1860s, the railroad business is really booming and really expanding. It got some help from the federal government with the Pacific Railroad Act and the commitment of federal dollars to build railroads. So Vanderbilt is there at the beginning, and he sees an opportunity, he takes it. And in the 1860s, he's very busy acquiring and consolidating other rail lines. And what Vanderbilt first tried to do was say, look, there are all these different local railroad companies, and they all serve local regional communities, and they all do things differently. And Vanderbilt at first had this approach. I'll try to be a friendly guy and take a diplomatic approach. I'll try to work with the different railroad companies to work out arrangements so that we can ship goods and people across our lines together. And that idea of cooperation was very nice, but it failed. So Vanderbilt then decides that the only thing he can do is acquire other railroad lines. And he's able to do this in part because he is able to provide his services at a cheaper rate. That is, he's more efficient. He's understood the techniques of management and using new technologies to then provide a more efficient service at a lower price. And so he's able to eventually run his competitors clearly just right out of business. And then he buys up these other rail lines, and he creates a huge railroad called the New York Central. Now, he had one setback, and that was the Erie Railroad War in the 1870s. There was the Erie Railroad that Vanderbilt wanted to buy. He didn't like the owner, a man by the name of Daniel Drew. Daniel Drew had opposed Vanderbilt on several occasions. So Vanderbilt really had it out for Daniel Drew and the Erie Railroad, so he starts to buy up stock in the Erie Railroad. And that's the story that I want to focus on. How do you build big companies? Well, you acquire them. How do you acquire companies? You do it by buying stock. Stock is, and we'll go forward, stock is really a certificate of ownership in the company. And if I could flip over there, you can see on the upper right-hand side a stock certificate in the New York Central Railroad. And that's how you went about it. Now, Vanderbilt had the financial resources in part, so he had cash on his own to buy these stocks in other companies, therefore acquiring them. But he also understood banking and Wall Street. And he was able to get other people, we'll call them investors, to loan him money so that he could actually carry out these acquisitions. And the idea was the bigger the company got, the more profitable it would become. And then Vanderbilt could repay the people, the investors that lent him money, and still make money. And Vanderbilt was really one of the first to understand this mechanism of using banks and finance and Wall Street to create really large corporations. And again, the New York Central Railroad was one of the largest, and so it instructs us into how big companies got built. And Vanderbilt is, simply put, the most successful. And he had connections. And so you might say, well, is that fair? Here's Vanderbilt, who was already successful as a steamboat guy. Now he's getting into railroads. He has these connections. He uses these connections. He's ruthless. Is it fair? I mean, does the ordinary person, worker, whatever, have the same ability to do what Vanderbilt did? And the answer is yes, in theory, but in reality, no, because Vanderbilt simply had all these connections. And you can see there the stock market floor. So I think that the idea of how Vanderbilt did this. Now, in terms of the Erie Railroad War, Vanderbilt failed. The Erie Railroad Company, led by Daniel Drew, came up with another interesting solution to Vanderbilt's attempt to buy them out. They just printed more stock and issued more stock. So as Vanderbilt's busy buying up the existing stock, the Erie Company is issuing more stock. Now, that led to a series of legal battles. Vanderbilt said, hey, that's illegal. The company can't just simply issue all this new stock, so I can't buy it. And eventually a judge agreed with Vanderbilt, but then trying to enforce that became a legal mess. So we can see that it really gets a little complicated here, folks, when you have the legal system and lawyers involved with these large, corporate titans like Vanderbilt trying to take over companies. To make a long story short, the Erie Railroad did resist Vanderbilt's attempts to buy them. And so that was the one area where he did fail. But nonetheless, I think the story is illustrative and serves as a good example of how the American economy began to work in the Gilded Age. And clearly, there are companies that organize in different areas, whether it be railroad, whether it be oil, whether it be sugar, whether it be meat, whether it be steel, you name the sector, they all seem to follow the similar path towards arriving at large-scale operations. And we'll stop there for today. Thank you.